Chapter 1. An Invitation to Townsend Manor. The end of summer hung in the air as Tony Middleton and Sally Cartwright made their way down the winding, tree-lined road to Townsend Manor. They could hardly believe they'd been invited to such a grand estate, especially for the annual village fest. Their classmate, Jake Townsend, had mentioned it casually during one of their long lunch breaks, as though every schoolmate of his were accustomed to country manners and family gatherings. But for Tony and Sally, both born and raised in modest homes, the idea of spending a weekend at a grand English manor was the stuff of novels. The manor itself was a sight to behold. It stood tall and proud against the evening sky, its stone walls etched with ivy that climbed toward the gabled roofs. The windows were framed with thick, heavy shutters that hadn't been replaced for centuries, and the grounds stretched on endlessly, with perfectly trimmed hedges and ancient oak trees casting shadows across the gravel driveway. A sense of mystery seemed to wrap around the place. "Imagine growing up here," Sally murmured, taking in the grandeur. Tony shrugged. "Jake's probably just not the sort to carry on with traditions. But there's definitely something strange about this family." They shared a laugh as the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of formality. She was dressed in an immaculate black dress with a small white apron, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "You must be Mr. Middleton and Miss Cartwright," she said, looking them over. "I'm Mrs. Braddock, the housekeeper. Master Jake has told us you'd be arriving." "Thank you, Mrs. Braddock," Sally said with a polite nod. They followed her inside, stepping into a vast foyer with high ceilings and a grand chandelier that glistened under the warm light. Paintings lined the walls, each one depicting a stern-faced ancestor of the Townsend family. Their eyes seemed to follow the newcomers as Mrs. Braddock led them through the hallways, and Tony couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching them. "Lady Eliza is awaiting you in the drawing room," Mrs. Braddock informed them as they reached a set of polished mahogany doors. "Lady Eliza?" Sally whispered to Tony. "Isn't that Jake's aunt?" "Yes," Tony whispered back. "She's the head of the family. Apparently quite the character from what Jake said." The doors swung open to reveal a stately room with plush velvet chairs, thick drapes, and a large, roaring fireplace. Seated by the fire was Lady Eliza Townsend, a tall, imposing woman with silver hair styled elegantly. She wore a dark green dress and held a teacup in one hand, her sharp gaze resting on Tony and Sally as they entered. Her presence was as intimidating as it was refined. "Ah, Jake's friends," Lady Eliza said in a voice that commanded attention. "You must be Tony and Sally. I trust the journey wasn't too taxing?" "Not at all, Lady Townsend," Tony replied, his tone respectful. Lady Eliza gave a faint smile, though it barely softened her expression. "I've heard that the two of you have a keen eye for mysteries. Jake speaks quite highly of your detective skills, as he calls them." Sally felt her cheeks flush. "Jake's very kind, my lady. We've just had a bit of luck solving small things now and then." Lady Eliza's gaze grew more intense, as if she were probing their minds for hidden intentions. "Luck, is it? Well, I suppose one could say that, though I've often found that luck is simply another word for the right instincts." She placed her teacup down and gestured to the chairs nearby. "Do sit. I'm sure you're curious about our little village celebration." As they settled in, Lady Eliza began to explain the origins of the village fest, a tradition that had been carried out by the Townsend family for generations. It was a weekend filled with games, dances, and feasts, a gathering that brought together families from across the county. She spoke of the importance of legacy, of upholding traditions in a world that seemed to be changing too quickly. There was an unmistakable pride in her voice. "Naturally, the Townsends have always played a prominent role in the village," Lady Eliza said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's our responsibility to ensure the festival's success." Jake entered the room just then, his easygoing demeanor breaking through the formality. He greeted Tony and Sally with a grin. He introduced them to Mr. Avery, Lady Eliza's solicitor, who had arrived earlier in the day and stood off to the side, watching quietly. Mr. Avery was a slight man, with thin hair and sharp features that gave him a perpetually wary look. The introductions continued, and soon they were joined by Emma, the young maid. She was a girl of around 17, with a nervous disposition and a quick, darting gaze. She curtsied politely but seemed to avoid Lady Eliza's eye as she offered tea and biscuits to the newcomers. As the evening wore on, Tony and Sally grew more comfortable, but they couldn't shake the odd, simmering undercurrent in the house. Lady Eliza's strict presence, Mr. Avery's calculating gaze, and Mrs. Braddock's stern formality created a peculiar atmosphere that felt almost stifling. Once they were finally shown to their rooms, Tony turned to Sally as soon as the door closed. "Did you feel it too? This place? It's like there's something hidden beneath every smile and every glance." Sally nodded, her mind racing. "And did you notice how Lady Eliza spoke about Jake? Almost as though she was disappointed in him." Tony shrugged. "Jake's probably just not the sort to carry on with traditions. But there's definitely something strange about this family." Sally's eyes twinkled with excitement. "Well, we might just find out more tomorrow. After all, we're here for the whole weekend. And if there's anything we've learned from our past cases, it's that things are rarely as they seem." They shared a knowing look. The quiet thrill of potential mystery filled the air, and as they settled into bed, they couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. They had come for a festive weekend, but something told them that Townsend Manor held much more than it let on. Chapter 2. Shadows over the Manor. The morning air at Townsend Manor was crisp, with a light fog hovering over the grounds. Tony and Sally rose early, eager to explore. They slipped out of their rooms, hoping to catch a glimpse of the manor's more hidden corners before the bustle of the day began. Descending the grand staircase, they marveled at the house's lavish decor. Antique tapestries lined the walls, depicting scenes from centuries past, while marble statues of stern-faced ancestors seemed to guard the corridors. The faint scent of lavender and old wood filled the air. "Good morning, Master Middleton and Miss Cartwright," came a voice from behind them. They spun around to find Mrs. Braddock, the housekeeper, standing silently in the hallway. Her dark eyes held a hint of disapproval, as though she could read their curiosity and found it less than respectable. She wore the same crisp black dress and white apron as the night before, with her hair neatly pulled back into a tight bun. "We were just admiring the manor," Tony stammered. Mrs. Braddock's lips tightened into a thin smile. "Admiration is fine, so long as it doesn't lead to mischief. Lady Eliza insists that all guests respect the house and its privacy." She paused, scrutinizing them. "Breakfast is served in the morning room. Master Jake will join you shortly." With that, she turned and walked away, her shoes tapping rhythmically against the stone floor. "She certainly knows how to keep people on edge," he whispered. "She's just loyal to Lady Eliza, I suppose," Sally replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Braddock was more than a little overprotective of the manor and its occupants. They made their way to the morning room, a bright and inviting space overlooking the garden. Jake was already there, tucking into a hearty breakfast. He waved them over, grinning. "Good morning, detectives," he teased. "Morning, Jake," Tony said. "Did you sleep well?" Jake shrugged. "As well as one can in this place. Aunt Eliza's rules make it feel more like a museum than a home." Sally raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" Jake rolled his eyes, leaning in conspiratorially. "Oh, there are plenty. No going into the West Wing, preserving the family history, she calls it. No wandering outside after dark, no touching certain heirlooms in the library, and so on." He paused, his expression softening. "She wasn't always like this. It's only been in the past few years that she's become so rigid, ever since my parents passed. A somber silence fell over the group. Tony and Sally exchanged a look. They both understood the weight of family expectations, though perhaps not to the same degree as Jake. But their quiet moment was interrupted by the entrance of Mr. Avery, Lady Eliza's solicitor. Mr. Avery was a slight man with graying hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a manner that seemed perpetually cautious. He held a stack of papers close to his chest, as though guarding them with his life. He greeted Jake with a nod, but his gaze lingered on Tony and Sally with thinly veiled suspicion. "Ah, Master Jake," he began, his voice smooth and clipped. "Your aunt has asked me to remind you that you are to assist with the preparations for tonight's gathering." Jake sighed. "Yes, Mr. Avery. I haven't forgotten." Mr. Avery's eyes narrowed. "Good. Lady Eliza would like everything to be perfect for this year's festival." With that, he turned on his heel and exited as quickly as he had entered, his footsteps fading down the hallway. "He's almost as bad as Mrs. Braddock," Jake muttered. "Always watching, always whispering in Aunt Eliza's ear. She listens to every word he says, too." "Do you trust him?" Sally asked, curious. Jake hesitated. "I'm not sure. He's been with the family for years, but there's something about him. Something cold. And Aunt Eliza's made him responsible for all the family's affairs. I sometimes wonder if he has more control over her than he lets on." After breakfast, Tony and Sally decided to take a walk in the garden to discuss what they'd seen. The garden was vast and beautiful, filled with blooming roses, neatly trimmed hedges, and a fountain adorned with stone cherubs. But despite its beauty, an odd sense of melancholy seemed to linger over it. As they strolled along the path, they noticed Emma, the young maid from the night before, tending to a patch of lavender. She worked quickly, but her hands trembled slightly, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being watched. Sensing an opportunity, Sally called out to her, "Hello, Emma. Lovely morning, isn't it?" Emma jumped, nearly dropping her shears. She managed a nervous smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Yes, miss. Very lovely." Sally noticed the tension in her voice. "You must be busy with all the preparations for the festival." Emma nodded, her gaze darting toward the manor. "Yes, miss. There's much to be done. Mrs. Braddock insists on perfection, and Lady Eliza, well, she has very high standards." "Is Lady Eliza always so strict?" Tony asked, trying to sound casual. Emma hesitated, glancing around as though fearing someone might overhear. "She wasn't always like this," she whispered. "But things changed after Mr. and Mrs. Townsend's accident. Lady Eliza took charge of everything, and she seems afraid of something. She doesn't say it, but you can see it in her eyes, and in Mr. Avery's eyes, too. They're always so watchful, always listening." Intrigued, Tony pressed on. "Do you think something happened? Something besides the accident?" Emma shook her head quickly, a shadow of fear crossing her face. I wouldn't know, sir. Lady Eliza's been through a lot, that's all." Sally offered her a warm smile. "Thank you, Emma. We won't keep you any longer." Emma nodded gratefully, returning to her work with an expression of relief. "What do you think?" Tony asked, his voice low. Sally frowned. "I think there's something she's not telling us. Maybe it's just gossip, but what could Lady Eliza be afraid of?" Before they could ponder further, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Mrs. Braddock, her expression as stern as ever. She eyed them suspiciously. "Are you enjoying the garden?" she asked, her tone cool. "Very much, thank you," Tony replied with a polite smile. "Good. Lady Eliza likes her guests to appreciate the beauty of Townsend Manor." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Though I must remind you both, some areas of the manor are off limits, particularly to visitors." "Of course," Sally said. With a curt nod, Mrs. Braddock turned and disappeared down the path, leaving them alone once more. They stood in silence for a moment, the garden now feeling less like a peaceful haven and more like a carefully controlled space. "Something's definitely off," Tony murmured. "It's like they're all hiding something, and they don't want us to find it." "Agreed," Sally replied. "But whatever it is, we'll have to tread carefully. Everyone here seems to have secrets." They spent the rest of the day observing, slipping into conversations where they could, noting every peculiar glance and hidden gesture. They noticed how Mrs. Braddock kept a close watch over every activity, scolding the servants if anything was even slightly amiss. Mr. Avery remained a silent, looming presence, often seen talking quietly with Lady Eliza in the library, their faces set in grim expressions. By evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tony and Sally returned to their rooms, feeling both exhilarated and unnerved. As the house settled into a tense quietness, the two young sleuths couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lying in wait beneath the manor's grand exterior, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 3. An Ominous Evening. As dusk settled, lanterns were lit along the pathways, their soft glow lending a ghostly air to the sprawling estate. The festivities would begin soon, with villagers arriving to join in the traditional evening banquet. A low hum of excitement permeated the air as servants rushed about, setting up tables and lighting candles around the garden. Tony and Sally stood on the steps of the manor, taking in the transformation. Townsend Manor had shed some of its foreboding atmosphere, now wrapped in a faint, almost magical light. Their reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Eliza, who swept past them, dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown. The gown was adorned with silver embroidery, creating an impression of stars shimmering against a night sky. Lady Eliza's presence commanded attention, her movements as precise as her words. She acknowledged Tony and Sally with a brief nod. "Good evening," she said smoothly. "I trust you both have enjoyed your stay so far?" "Very much, Lady Eliza," Sally replied, though she noticed a guarded look in Lady Eliza's eyes. "Excellent," she replied. Her gaze shifted toward the driveway, where villagers were beginning to arrive in small groups, eager to join the festivities. "Tonight is a very special occasion, as I'm sure you've heard. It's the heart of our family's tradition, and the pride of Townsend Manor." She paused, looking at the manor as if it were a living, breathing entity. "I expect nothing but perfection tonight." With that, she turned and walked toward the arriving guests, leaving Tony and Sally to exchange a glance. Lady Eliza seemed more tense than usual, her posture rigid and her gaze distant. As the night wore on, the gardens filled with laughter, music, and the lively sounds of village folk mingling. A string quartet played soft, soothing melodies, and servants circulated trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres. Yet beneath the merriment, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the manor. Tony and Sally drifted through the crowd, observing the guests and their hosts, picking up snippets of conversation. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something significant. And it was during one of these laps around the garden that they noticed Jake standing by himself, looking slightly uncomfortable. He'd dressed in a tailored suit, clearly chosen by Lady Eliza, and he seemed more like a reluctant participant than a proud host. "Hey, Jake," Tony greeted, joining him. "How's the party treating you?" Jake sighed, rolling his eyes. "Same as always. Aunt Eliza wants everything perfect, which means I'm supposed to stand around looking respectable." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Not exactly my idea of a good time, if you ask me." Sally smiled sympathetically. "I can't blame you. It must be strange, having all these people here, all this formality." "You don't know the half of it," Jake muttered. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Listen, there's something I need to tell you both. Something strange has been happening around here lately." "What do you mean?" Tony asked. Jake glanced over his shoulder, as though to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I've been hearing things. At night, in the West Wing, the part of the manor that Aunt Eliza forbids anyone from entering. I don't know what it is, but there's this scraping sound like something heavy is being dragged." Sally's brow furrowed. "Have you ever gone to check it out?" Jake shook his head. "Are you kidding? Aunt Eliza would have my head if she found out. But I've asked Mrs. Braddock about it, and she claims it's just the wind or some nonsense like that." He paused, lowering his voice further. "But I don't believe her. I think she knows more than she's letting on." The three of them stood in silence, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. Just as Tony opened his mouth to suggest they investigate further, the sound of a glass shattering interrupted them. They turned to see Mr. Avery, Lady Eliza's solicitor, standing near a table, his face flushed and his hands trembling slightly. He had knocked over a wine glass, and Mrs. Braddock was already rushing over, her face taut with barely concealed irritation. As she helped him clean up, Mr. Avery shot a glance at Lady Eliza, who was watching him with a look of disapproval. "Mr. Avery seems a bit out of sorts, doesn't he?" Sally observed, frowning. Jake nodded. "He's been on edge all day. Aunt Eliza's been speaking to him in private for hours, and he seemed even more nervous afterward." As the night continued, Tony and Sally kept a close eye on Mr. Avery, Lady Eliza, and Mrs. Braddock, each of whom appeared to be concealing something. The guests, however, remained blissfully unaware of the mounting tension. The festivities were in full swing when, suddenly, a loud cry pierced the air. The laughter stopped abruptly, and the crowd turned to see Emma, the young maid, running from the manor, her face pale as a ghost. She's dead!" Emma gasped, clutching at her apron. Her voice trembled. "Lady Eliza, she's dead!" A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. The guests looked at each other in disbelief, their faces filled with horror and confusion. Tony, Sally, and Jake exchanged a quick look before hurrying toward the manor, with Mr. Avery and Mrs. Braddock close behind. Inside, Lady Eliza's private study lay in chaos. Papers were strewn across the desk, and an overturned teacup lay shattered on the floor, its contents spilled across the Persian rug. But the most disturbing sight of all was Lady Eliza herself, slumped over her desk, her face pale and lifeless. Her once commanding presence had been replaced by a haunting stillness, her eyes staring blankly ahead. Mr. Avery stumbled into the room, his face ashen. He approached Lady Eliza's body with trembling hands, his expression filled with grief and shock. "Lady Eliza," he murmured. "This can't be—" Mrs. Braddock stood in the doorway, her face set in grim determination. "Everyone out. This is no place for idle gawking," she snapped, her voice cold and severe. She directed her glare at Tony, Sally, and Jake, as if blaming them for this tragedy. Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves as they left the study. Once they were outside, Jake pulled them aside, his face pale. "It was poison," he whispered, his voice thick with horror. "I just know it. Aunt Eliza was fine this morning. There's no way she would just die like this." Sally's mind was already piecing things together. If she was poisoned, then someone in that room had to be responsible, someone who had access to her private study, who knew her routines. Mr. Avery and Mrs. Braddock were deep in conversation, their voices tense. Mr. Avery appeared to be struggling to maintain his composure, while Mrs. Braddock's face was hard. "We need to keep a close eye on them," Tony whispered. "They're hiding something, I'm sure of it." The three friends huddled together, their determination growing with each passing moment. As the manor fell silent and the guests returned to their homes in a state of shock, Tony, Sally, and Jake vowed to uncover the truth. Chapter 4. Shadows of Suspicion. The morning after Lady Eliza's shocking death dawned cold and gray, casting a somber pall over Townsend Manor. The festive decorations still hung around the estate, a grim reminder of the celebration that had ended so tragically. Tony and Sally sat with Jake in the breakfast room, nursing cups of tea and discussing the mysterious events in low, hushed tones. The three friends knew the authorities would soon arrive, but none of them wanted to wait idly by. They had been thrust into the heart of a mystery, and they were determined to see it through. "Jake," Tony began, his voice serious, "we need to know everything you can tell us about Lady Eliza's life, who her close associates were, any recent conflicts or strange behavior, anything that might give us a clue." Jake hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might overhear. "Aunt Eliza, she wasn't easy to understand. She kept a lot to herself. Even with me, she was always very controlled, very secretive. But recently, she seemed tenser than usual." Sally leaned forward. "Do you think she was worried about something specific?" Jake nodded. "Yes. For the past few months, she's had these meetings with Mr. Avery, her solicitor. They'd go into her study and shut the door, sometimes for hours. I never knew what they discussed. But afterward, she would look tired, almost drained." Tony rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That might explain Mr. Avery's nervousness last night. He seemed on edge, almost like he was hiding something. "Or guilty," Sally added. "Mr. Avery was one of the last people to see her alive, after all." Jake's face grew troubled. "I don't want to believe it, but he might have had a reason to, well, want her out of the way. Aunt Eliza was incredibly wealthy, and her will was a point of contention in the family. Avery managed all her legal matters, so he would know her financial arrangements better than anyone." They fell into a tense silence, each lost in thought. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted their musings. Detective Inspector Harold Greaves entered, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes. He had an air of authority about him, his gaze sharp and appraising as he looked over the trio. "Good morning," he greeted, his tone brisk. "I understand you're Jake's friends from school, and that you were present at the festivities last night." Tony and Sally nodded, while Jake introduced them. The inspector's gaze softened slightly as he addressed Jake. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jake. Lady Eliza was well regarded in the community. I hope to bring swift justice to whoever is responsible." Jake muttered a quiet thanks, his face pale but resolute. Inspector Greaves wasted no time, diving into his questions with methodical precision. "Jake, do you know of any recent disagreements your aunt might have had? Any tensions within the household?" the inspector asked, his notepad poised. Jake repeated what he'd told Tony and Sally about Lady Eliza's secretive meetings with Mr. Avery, the strain it seemed to have put on her, and the unusually tight control she'd maintained over her personal affairs. Inspector Greaves nodded thoughtfully, scribbling in his notebook. "What about Mrs. Braddock?" Tony chimed in, his voice tentative. "She seemed unnerved last night, and rather abrupt with us. Do you think she might have had a reason to harm Lady Eliza?" Inspector Greaves raised an eyebrow, turning his penetrating gaze on Tony. "It's an interesting observation. Mrs. Braddock has been with Lady Eliza for years, but she's a strict woman, loyal but with a reputation for being intense. She and Lady Eliza shared a professional respect, but there may have been friction between them as of late." "What kind of friction?" Sally asked. Inspector Greaves shrugged. "I can't say for sure, but servants talk. There were rumors that Mrs. Braddock was unhappy with some recent changes Lady Eliza had proposed for the estate. She may have felt that her position was at risk." He paused. "Still, I would need more than mere rumors to treat Mrs. Braddock as a serious suspect." Before the conversation could continue, Mrs. Braddock herself appeared at the doorway, her face taut with a barely concealed grief. Her eyes landed on the inspector, and her tone was curt. "Inspector Greaves, if you're finished with the young master and his friends, I need to speak with you. It's about Lady Eliza's schedule yesterday. I have her diary, as you requested." Inspector Greaves nodded, excusing himself and following Mrs. Braddock into another room. "Do you think he suspects her?" Sally whispered, leaning toward Jake. I don't know, Jake replied. But Mrs. Braddock is definitely hiding something. She was acting even stranger than usual last night. And if she was really that loyal to Aunt Eliza, wouldn't she be more visibly upset? Tony frowned. Good point. She's so composed, it's like she was expecting this. The trio decided to wait for the inspector's return, hoping they might glean something from his reaction to Mrs. Braddock's account of the previous day. When he reappeared, he looked thoughtful, but offered them no additional information. Hours later, after the inspector had interviewed various other members of the household and most of the guests from the previous night, he reconvened with Tony, Sally, and Jake in the library. I'm pursuing several lines of inquiry, Inspector Greaves began, settling into an armchair. But I must emphasize that this case may take time. We're dealing with a sophisticated crime, not a spur-of-the-moment act. He leaned forward, studying each of them in turn. However, I'm intrigued by your observations. I'd like your continued cooperation. Sometimes an outsider's perspective can be helpful in piecing together these complex family dynamics. Tony, Sally, and Jake exchanged glances, nodding solemnly. Inspector Greaves pulled out his notebook. One final thing. I'd like to know if any of you have noticed anything unusual in Lady Eliza's behavior, especially in the last few days leading up to her death. Sally spoke up first. Lady Eliza was particularly guarded last night, even more than usual, I mean. She barely interacted with the guests and spent most of her time with Mr. Avery. Tony added, Jake mentioned hearing strange noises in the West Wing at night. We think Lady Eliza might have been hiding something there. Mrs. Braddock might know more about it, but she seems reluctant to talk. Inspector Greaves listened intently, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on his notebook. I see. This West Wing business is interesting. I may have to inspect it myself. He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. For now, I'll continue my investigation. I'd suggest that you three keep your distance and let the police handle things. However, if you do come across any other observations, you know where to find me. After the inspector left, Tony, Sally, and Jake remained seated. We need to check the West Wing, Tony declared firmly. If there's something there that Lady Eliza was hiding, it might be the key to understanding why she was killed. Jake hesitated, but then nodded, a look of steely resolve in his eyes. If it can help solve her murder, I'm willing to do it. Tonight, after everyone's asleep. They each left the library with a sense of purpose, agreeing to meet by the West Wing's entry later that night. As the manor fell silent and darkness once again crept into its shadowed corridors, Tony, Sally, and Jake prepared themselves to uncover whatever secrets lay buried within the forbidden wing. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Shadows. The clock had just struck midnight when Tony, Sally, and Jake met at the entrance to the West Wing. The house was silent, cloaked in shadows, and the only sounds were the faint creaks and sighs of the old manor settling into the night. The West Wing had been cordoned off for years, largely forgotten by the family. It was a part of Townsend Manor shrouded in mystery. Jake took a deep breath. Are we really doing this? Yes, Tony replied, a determined glint in his eyes. Lady Eliza must have kept something here, something she didn't want anyone else to find. If we can uncover what it was, it might just lead us to her killer. Sally gave Jake an encouraging nod, and together the three pressed forward. They moved through the main corridor of the wing, their small lantern casting an eerie, flickering glow on the walls around them. Every so often, they passed a closed door, each one seeming to guard secrets of its own. Why was this wing shut off in the first place? Sally asked. Family rumors? Jake replied, keeping his voice low. Years ago, there was talk of a scandal involving an ancestor of ours. No one knows exactly what happened, but ever since, the West Wing has been left untouched. They reached the end of the hallway and found a large, ornate door, its wood dark and worn with age. Jake pulled a key from his pocket, one he'd taken from Lady Eliza's desk drawer earlier that day. He slid it into the lock, and with a soft click, the door swung open. The room inside was grand but dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn tight over the windows. Dusty sheets covered the furniture, and an odd smell lingered in the air, a mix of old books, stale air, and something metallic, faintly unpleasant. In the center of the room was a massive oak desk, its surface littered with old papers and scattered objects. Jake moved forward and lifted the edge of one of the sheets covering a chair. "I used to wonder what was back here, but Aunt Eliza always refused to talk about it." They began searching the room carefully, combing through the desk drawers, the shelves, and the various cabinets that lined the walls. Tony rifled through stacks of old letters, his brows furrowing as he read snippets here and there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Most of the letters were harmless, detailing family matters and estate business, but one caught his eye. "Look at this," he whispered, handing the letter to Sally and Jake. It was addressed to Lady Eliza, dated only a few months prior, and was signed by none other than Mr. Avery. The letter was cryptic, filled with veiled references to urgent matters and delicate issues that needed to be resolved quickly. There was a distinct sense of urgency, as if Mr. Avery were pushing Lady Eliza toward a decision she was reluctant to make. "This could explain her tension," Sally murmured. "It sounds like she was under pressure and Avery was in the thick of it." Jake frowned. "But why would he do that? Avery's always been so loyal to our family. Why would he pressure Aunt Eliza like this?" Tony glanced around the room thoughtfully. Maybe he wasn't as loyal as he seemed, or maybe he was using his position to manipulate her for his own gain. Just as Tony was about to continue, Sally let out a soft gasp. She had been examining a tall cabinet in the corner of the room, and her fingers had grazed something unusual, a hidden compartment. With a click, the panel slid open, revealing a small, locked box inside. "What's in there?" Tony asked, moving closer to peer over her shoulder. Sally looked at Jake, who still held the key they'd used to unlock the door. "Let's try the key," she suggested, handing him the box. Jake inserted the key, and to their surprise, it fit perfectly. The lock clicked open, and Jake lifted the lid with bated breath. Inside were a handful of items, a faded photograph of a man they didn't recognize, a small vial with a clear liquid, and a letter addressed to Lady Eliza in bold, unfamiliar handwriting. Tony picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the words as he read aloud. "Eliza, you know as well as I do that what we've done cannot be erased. Our actions, our choices, they will come to haunt us. The past is never truly buried, and one day someone will find out. When that time comes, you must be prepared to face the consequences." There was no signature, but the letter was dated nearly 20 years earlier. "What could this mean?" Jake whispered, his face pale. "What was she involved in?" Sally's gaze fell on the vial, and her expression darkened. That liquid, it could be poison, perhaps the same poison that killed her. Tony nodded grimly. "It's possible. Lady Eliza might have kept it as a reminder, a warning to herself, or perhaps as leverage against someone who knew her secret." Jake held up the photograph. "And this man, do you think he was part of it?" They examined the photograph closely, noting the man's stern expression and formal attire. There was something almost haunting about his eyes. "I don't recognize him," Jake admitted, "but if Aunt Eliza kept his photo here, he must have been important." They decided to take the letter and the photograph back to their rooms, hoping to compare it to any other documents they might come across later. Just as they were about to close the compartment, Tony noticed another scrap of paper tucked inside. Pulling it out, he realized it was a fragment of a will, mentioning specific inheritance details. It referenced large sums and properties, some of which had allegedly been diverted to Mr. Avery for safekeeping. "This is huge," Sally murmured. "If Mr. Avery was mismanaging her estate, or worse, embezzling from her, he would have a very strong motive to keep her silent." The room suddenly felt colder, as if the very walls held secrets that they weren't meant to uncover. "We should go," Tony whispered, glancing nervously around the room. "If anyone catches us here, it could jeopardize everything." The trio quickly closed the cabinet, replaced the sheets, and quietly slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind them. The hallway stretched ahead, silent and dark, as they made their way back to their rooms, careful to avoid making any noise that might rouse the household. Once they were safely back in their quarters, they spread out the evidence they had collected on the bed, studying it in the light of a single lantern. "It seems we have two possibilities," Tony said thoughtfully. "Either Mr. Avery was using Lady Eliza for financial gain, or there was something far deeper and darker at play. This letter makes it sound like she was involved in something secretive and dangerous years ago, something she couldn't escape." Sally nodded. "Maybe Mr. Avery knew her secret and used it against her. If Lady Eliza felt trapped, she might have tried to confront him, and he might have silenced her." Jake shuddered at the thought. "We have to take this to Inspector Greaves. He needs to know what we found." They agreed, and after stowing the documents safely away, they each retreated to their respective rooms. The night was far from over, and they all knew the answers they sought were still hidden, lurking in the shadows of Townsend Manor. As the clock struck 3, Tony, Sally, and Jake finally drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by the secrets they'd uncovered and the lingering presence of Lady Eliza. Somewhere in the manor, a creak echoed through the empty halls, a reminder that the past was never truly buried and that more secrets waited to be unearthed. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Investigation. The morning sun cast a faint watery light over Townsend Manor. Tony, Sally, and Jake awoke with a sense of urgency, each still haunted by their discoveries in the West Wing the previous night. They had agreed to present their findings to Inspector Greaves. They found him in the library, his stern face buried in a stack of documents as he reviewed notes from his initial interviews. He looked up as they entered. "Ah, Jake, Miss Cartwright, Mr. Middleton," he greeted, gesturing for them to sit. "You look as though you've uncovered something of importance." Tony took a deep breath and recounted their nocturnal venture into the West Wing, describing the cryptic letter, the photograph, and the vial they'd found in the secret compartment. Sally handed over the items, and the inspector took each one, studying them intently. Intriguing," Inspector Greaves murmured, examining the letter first. He read it twice, his frown deepening with each line. Then he turned his attention to the photograph, his eyes narrowing as he traced the unfamiliar face. Finally, he picked up the vial, holding it up to the light. "You say this was hidden in a compartment in Lady Eliza's study in the West Wing?" he asked. "Yes," Sally confirmed. "Jake mentioned that Lady Eliza had always kept that part of the house off limits. We thought that if she hid things there, they must be important." Inspector Greaves nodded, his gaze shifting between them. "Well done. This is quite a significant discovery. However, before drawing any conclusions, I must ask, what made you think to explore the West Wing? You realize that trespassing into restricted parts of the manor could compromise my investigation?" Jake paled slightly, but Tony stepped in. "We were concerned, Inspector. We felt there was something off about Lady Eliza's behavior and the circumstances of her death. We thought this might help uncover the truth." The inspector's expression softened slightly, and he gave them a nod of reluctant approval. "I appreciate your honesty and your insight. Lady Eliza did indeed have a rather enigmatic history. I've learned she was involved in a discreet network of associates, though specifics are sparse. This letter, however, hints at a secret she may have shared with others, perhaps even Mr. Avery." He paused, his eyes falling on the photograph. This man, whoever he is, could have held sway over her in some way. It's possible that he, too, knew of whatever Lady Eliza was hiding. Sally leaned forward. "Inspector, Do you think Mr. Avery was involved in this network of hers? Could he have been manipulating her? Inspector Greaves tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. Mr. Avery is indeed a person of interest. His proximity to Lady Eliza's finances and affairs, combined with this unusual pressure he placed on her, is suspicious. But he is not the only one under scrutiny. At this, he opened a small folder and retrieved notes he had compiled on the 3 prime suspects they had so far identified. Tony, Sally, and Jake listened intently as he reviewed each one in turn. First, there's Mr. Avery. As Lady Eliza's solicitor, he had control over her legal and financial matters, and this letter suggests he may have used that position to influence her decisions. If he was aware of her secrets, he may have held leverage, possibly for financial gain. He paused and glanced at the letter. The phrase, "our actions cannot be erased," makes me think that he may have shared a past with Lady Eliza, something unsavory that neither wanted to see the light of day. "Now, Mrs. Braddock," Greaves continued, pulling up another sheet. "She's been a loyal housekeeper for years, but recently there were whispers of tension between her and Lady Eliza. Lady Eliza had been considering major changes to the estate, including possibly dismissing Mrs. Braddock from her position, which would have left her destitute. If she felt betrayed after years of loyalty, she may have been desperate enough to act." "Do you think Mrs. Braddock knew about Lady Eliza's secrets?" Jake asked. "It's possible," Greaves replied. "Servants often know more about their employers than we give them credit for. If Mrs. Braddock was privy to Lady Eliza's activities, or even suspected them, she may have felt an overwhelming resentment, especially if she thought Lady Eliza's actions would endanger the household or her own position." Tony frowned, still mulling over the photograph. "And what about Mr. Avery? He seemed almost too eager to stay out of the investigation. Could he have known Lady Eliza's secrets and been trying to protect himself by distancing?" The inspector nodded. "Mr. Avery, he is Lady Eliza's financial advisor, tasked with maintaining her wealth and securing her investments. He had great influence over her, and some of her recent financial decisions were reportedly under his counsel. If he mismanaged funds or even manipulated her assets to cover personal ventures, he might have had every reason to fear discovery." Greaves leaned forward, his voice lowering. "And yet, none of these motives entirely explain the poison. It's a deliberate, calculated method of murder. It's subtle, with minimal signs, and one that requires close access to the victim's meals or drinks. It requires planning." A long silence followed, and then Sally broke it. "So, Inspector, what will you do next?" "Follow the trail," he said resolutely. "The poison is our strongest lead, and it's crucial to find out who had access to Lady Eliza's food and drink the day she was poisoned. I'll need to speak with the kitchen staff, any servants who might have been involved, and of course Mrs. Braddock herself." Just as the inspector was about to leave, a young maid appeared at the library door, her face flushed. "Inspector Greaves, sir?" she stammered, wringing her hands nervously. I've just come from Mr. Avery's quarters. He's vanished." The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Inspector Greaves' face hardened. "Vanished? Explain, please." The maid gulped. "I was cleaning the guest rooms, sir, and when I reached Mr. Avery's, it was empty. The bed was unslept in, and his things were gone. I checked with the other servants. None of them saw him leave, but he's nowhere to be found." Inspector Greaves rose swiftly, his expression grim. "Thank you. You may go." After the maid left, he turned back to Tony, Sally, and Jake. "This changes things. Avery's disappearance could mean one of two things. Either he's guilty and is fleeing the consequences, or he's been taken by surprise and forced into hiding for his own safety." Tony clenched his fists. Either way, it means he knew something important. Lady Eliza's secrets might be bigger than we realized. Greaves nodded solemnly. "It appears so. I'll search his quarters and see if there's any indication of his plans, but in the meantime, I suggest you three stay vigilant. It's clear that someone in this manor is willing to go to great lengths to protect their secrets." Before they left the library, Inspector Greaves put a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "Jake, you and your friends have done well, but I must emphasize that this investigation is entering a critical stage. If Mr. Avery's life is in danger, so could yours be. Stay alert, and if you notice anything out of the ordinary, inform me at once." Jake nodded, his face pale but determined. The three friends left the library. The manor, once a familiar and comforting place, now seemed filled with shadows and unseen threats. As dusk fell over Townsend Manor, Tony, Sally, and Jake sat together, deep in thought, contemplating the enigmatic secrets that Lady Eliza had left behind. Chapter 7. Unmasking the Shadows. The atmosphere at Townsend Manor was tense and brittle as glass the following morning. The news of Mr. Avery's disappearance had spread rapidly among the guests and staff. "Mr. Avery's disappearance," Sally mused. "It almost feels like a move in some twisted game. Whoever is behind this knows exactly what they're doing." Jake, visibly more nervous than the others, nodded. "If someone's gone to the lengths of poisoning Aunt Eliza and now forcing Mr. Avery to flee or disappear, we're dealing with a mind that's methodical." "Agreed," Tony replied, his jaw clenched. "I think we need to return to the West Wing." Inspector Greaves only glanced through Mr. Avery's papers. The three friends slipped quietly into the West Wing, moving with caution and vigilance. Upon reaching Lady Eliza's study, they shut the door behind them. The room was just as they'd left it the night before, with the cryptic letter, photograph, and vial still lying on the table. "Let's start by going through Mr. Avery's belongings," Sally suggested. "If he was involved in this secret of Lady Eliza's, there must be something he left behind. A letter, a note, something." They began a meticulous search, dividing up the room to comb through drawers, cabinets, and every available nook. Tony took the bookshelf, Sally sifted through a chest of papers near the window, and Jake examined the small writing desk near the door. After several minutes of fruitless searching, Tony stumbled upon a small notebook tucked behind a row of dusty, seldom-read volumes on the bookshelf. He carefully opened it and found himself staring at a series of dates and names, none of which were familiar. "Look at this," he said, handing the notebook to Sally. "These dates go back over the past 5 years, and the names, they're not people I recognize. But what if they're part of Lady Eliza's network?" Sally's eyes scanned the names thoughtfully. "Perhaps these are her contacts, or the people she was associated with. It's strange, though. There are no details, just the names and dates." Jake pointed to a date marked just 2 days before Lady Eliza's death. Next to it was the name H.M. Blackwood. "Blackwood? That name seems familiar," Jake said, furrowing his brow. "I remember hearing Aunt Eliza mention a Mr. Blackwood once, but I assumed he was just a friend from her charity circle." Sally flipped to the final pages of the notebook and found a hastily scribbled note, nearly illegible due to the rushed hand it was written in. It read, "The clock strikes tonight. It cannot be undone." Sally's heart pounded as she read the ominous words. "Do you think Mr. Avery wrote this? It seems to be his handwriting, and if the clock strikes tonight was some sort of message to Lady Eliza, then whatever happened was premeditated." Tony frowned. But why leave such a cryptic note in her study of all places? Unless it was meant for someone else to find. Just then, the door to the study creaked open. Startled, the three of them turned, only to see Inspector Greaves standing in the doorway, his gaze sharp and observant. "Care to explain why you're in here?" he asked, crossing his arms. Caught off guard, they hesitated, but Tony took a step forward, holding out the notebook. "Inspector, we found this among Lady Eliza's belongings. There are names and dates in here that may be linked to her secret activities, and a note from Mr. Avery that seems to suggest he knew something was going to happen to her." Inspector Greaves took the notebook, his face hardening as he scanned its contents. H.M. Blackwood, and this message. It appears Lady Eliza had associations beyond mere acquaintances. He flipped through the pages, pausing thoughtfully on the scribbled note. The clock strikes tonight. It's as if he foresaw something dreadful. But why leave if he knew it would implicate him? Sally spoke up. Inspector, do you think Mr. Avery may have been trying to warn Lady Eliza? Maybe he knew she was in danger but couldn't confront her directly. Inspector Greaves seemed to consider her suggestion, his eyes narrowing as he processed this possibility. It's a reasonable theory. However, the involvement of Blackwood here troubles me. I know of only one Blackwood, and he has a rather dubious reputation. The inspector went on to explain that H.M. Blackwood was a former associate of several influential families, a man with a murky background and a history of financial manipulations. Known for his persuasive charm and manipulative tactics, Blackwood had vanished from the social scene a few years prior after being suspected of orchestrating several high-profile scandals. However, nothing had ever been proven. If Lady Eliza was indeed in contact with Blackwood, Inspector Greaves continued, it's likely she was drawn into a much larger scheme, one that could have endangered her life. A sudden knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and a maid entered, her face pale and her voice trembling. Sir, I thought you should know. Mrs. Braddock? She's gone too. The inspector's gaze darkened. Gone? Explain. I went to bring her breakfast this morning, but her room was empty, and the bed wasn't slept in, the maid stammered. I asked the other servants, but no one's seen her since last night. Inspector Greaves gripped the notebook tightly, his expression resolute. It appears our suspect may be fleeing. Gather all the staff and ensure no one else leaves the manor. It seems we have not one, but two disappearances on our hands. Whoever had orchestrated Lady Eliza's death had likely enlisted others within the manor to carry out their plan, and was now eliminating them to tie up loose ends. Inspector Greaves quickly took charge, organizing a search of the manor and grounds. Tony, Sally, and Jake accompanied him, hoping they might stumble upon some clue that would unravel the mystery. As they made their way through the dim, winding corridors of Townsend Manor, Sally's thoughts returned to the cryptic letter they had found earlier. Our actions cannot be erased. After hours of searching, they came upon a storage room near the back of the manor, filled with old furniture, trunks, and a dusty collection of household odds and ends. There, hidden beneath a stack of old quilts, they found Mrs. Braddock, unconscious and bound. She had been left in a dark corner, with only a small trickle of light streaming in through a crack in the boarded-up window. Inspector Greaves immediately called for assistance, and the housemaid was carefully unbound and roused. As she regained consciousness, her eyes were wild with fear. Mrs. Braddock, Inspector Greaves said gently, we need to know who did this to you. Do you remember anything? Mrs. Braddock's voice was shaky. It was Mr. Avery, she whispered, her gaze filled with terror. He told me Lady Eliza knew too much. He said she would ruin him, and that if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me too. Inspector Greaves' face was grim as he rose. This isn't over yet. Avery may have fled, but I'll see to it he's found. As for you three, he said, turning to Tony, Sally, and Jake, your efforts in uncovering these secrets were invaluable. You've helped bring light to a dangerous conspiracy. Tony, Sally, and Jake felt a mix of relief and satisfaction as they looked around the room. They had faced shadows of both the past and present, unmasking a plot that could have remained buried.